Welcome everyone to NSTA web seminars where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Tonight's presentation is part of our series on the next generation science standards, cross-cutting concepts. And tonight's focus is on cause and effect, mechanism, and explanation. Our presenter is Tina Grotzer, and we do have Ted Willard online with us from NSTA to provide information about NGSS. My name is Bryn Slate. I will be moderating the program, and we have Jeff Lehman online with us from NSTA headquarters to provide technical support. Before we jump into our formal presentation, I did want to remind everyone to visit the NSTA Learning Center, which is your online portal for Teacher PD. And you'll find that we have over 10,600 resources there in the Learning Center. And at this point, we've got over 3,700 of those for free. And it's exciting. We're adding to those every month, so those numbers keep creeping skyward. And we do encourage you to check out the community forums so you can connect with other science teachers. If you need help finding resources in the Learning Center, you can click on that live support button and reach out to our online advisors. They will help you get what you're looking for. We also do have free tools that you can access to help you document your learning and show what you're working on in terms of your professional development. So do check it out by going to learningcenter.nsta.org. And now I would like to introduce today's presenters. First, we will have Ted Willard, NSTA's expert on the next generation science standards. And then our featured presenter is Tina Grotzer from Harvard University. So at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ted to get us started. Welcome, Ted.
Thanks, Bryn. Thanks, everyone, for being here this evening. I'm really excited to get into some more of the cross-cutting concepts and to hear what Tina has to say. I'm just going to give a quick little few slides of overview here so we're all on the same page here in terms of what's going on with NGSS. As you probably are aware, next generation science standards involve 4 organizations working together: the National Academies of Science, Achieve, NSTA, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And there's sort of a two-step process here. We have the academies, which developed the framework for K-12 science education, and that came out in July 2011. The standards themselves are currently under development. Sort of a consortium of 26 states is working on that, guided by Achieve. And it's from these standards that assessments, curricula, instruction, and professional development for teachers will come out and work on once the standards are released. The framework, as we mentioned, has 3 dimensions to it: scientific and engineering practices, which we looked at last fall; cross-cutting concepts, which we're looking at this spring; and disciplinary core ideas. This book is available free, so there's no excuse not to have a copy, and I strongly encourage you all to look at it. Look at it multiple times. I pull it out I don't know how many times in a week. You can also get a hard copy from the Science Store at NSTA Press. So the engineering practices here, things like asking questions, planning and carrying out investigations, and constructing explanations. These are appropriate for both science and for engineering. In most cases, they are the same practices in both cases, but in a few places, such as defining problems or designing solutions, there's a different practice for engineering than there is for science. The cross-cutting concepts: 2 weeks ago we looked at patterns. Today we're focused on cause and effect, mechanism, and explanation. And as the spring progresses, we will get into all the remaining cross-cutting concepts. The core ideas is sort of it's traditionally known as the content in science. We have life science, physical science, earth and space, and engineering, which in NGSS has been folded into all of this. Each of these places have subtopics, as you can see in life science, and if you go farther, even a deeper level for each of the pieces here. Not that I expect you to memorize that whole slide, but to see that there is an architecture here. So moving from that, we've got Achieve, developing the standards, working with those states. As I said, 26 states are involved in the development, and they will, when it comes out in less than a month now, be starting the process of taking a serious look at them, considering them for adoption. They do not have to adopt them, but they are all taking a careful look, and I think that there's a lot of excitement about them. The states that are in gray there, they also will have the option and the opportunity to adopt the standards, and so we expect that a very significant portion of the United States to all be working for the first time under the same set of science standards. Here's an example of what the pages in the standards look like. We have a performance expectation at the top of the page here, and then this area here, known as the foundation box, contains the scientific and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts. The purpose of this performance expectation, as I kind of note down here in this box, is to be instructions for assessment developers, for them to get a sense of what students should have achieved by the end of instruction, what students should be able to do at the end of instruction. And that mixes these elements here of the content that students should learn, the practices that they should be able to engage in, the cross-cutting concepts that they should have an understanding of. And so you can see here, develop molecular models of reactants and products to support the explanation that atoms and therefore mass are conserved in a chemical reaction. Develop molecular models to support an explanation. As an example of practices, we've got content here, reactants and products working together that atoms and therefore mass are conserved in a chemical reaction. And then this idea of conservation as being a cross-cutting concept that we're looking at. And so all those different elements are blended together, bound with each other to create a performance expectation. So now, having a chance to have seen those different elements there, we'll pass on to Tina to get us thinking more about cause and effect. Thank you, Tina.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to talk with you tonight about the role of cause and effect in the next generation science standards. I'd like to give you a sense of why this is a topic that I've been asked to talk about. I am an associate professor here in science education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and prior to that, spent time researching and also developing curriculum at Harvard Project Zero, where I still work today. I also worked in elementary and middle school for 14 years, but since the mid-1980s, my work has focused pretty much on the cognitive development of what's going on when students are thinking about the nature of causality and how that interacts with their science learning. So we've looked at a variety of science topics and how it interacts with their both conceptions and misconceptions or alternative conceptions in particular kinds of topics. So tonight what I'd like to do is talk about cause and effect as it's presently written into the current drafts of the next generation science standards. I want to give you a sense of how explanation involves reasoning about cause and effect in terms of both pattern and mechanism, which are two of the big ideas that we think about when we're teasing apart explanation and particularly causality or cause and effect. So they have each of those, and they each play a role and interact with the science learning, even though what you see primarily represented in the standards talks about mechanism. Pattern is actually in there as well. I'd like to offer you some examples from different grades, and we'll see how it plays out in the performance expectations and what that might mean for how you would go about teaching it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the language of causality and why it's so important to introduce into the classroom. One of the things I'm going to do is focus at the very end on some things to watch out for, because when we start to talk about causality at different ages and grade levels, there are different ways of thinking about it that will influence how we teach it and the kinds of conversations we're having with students in class. And then we're going to pause at the end for questions, and there's also a number of opportunities to talk about questions pretty much throughout. So I hope that, in the course of Bryn moderating, you'll be able to share some of, how things are working out for you, how you're understanding things. We have some questions worked in, and I'm hoping that we can help sort of move us all along in terms of our understanding of how cause and effect interact. So one of the caveats that I think is really important to share is that I have been interacting to some extent with the developers of the standards, but I know that they have been integrating all of the information that they've been receiving in different ways, and they've made choices based upon that. Cause and effect is very much woven into the other aspects of the standards. The performance expectations, really are woven together, and those of you who attended the sessions on science and engineering practices have probably spoken to a certain extent about cause and effect already as you talk about, testing and developing fair tests, etc. So there'll be a couple of things that I'll alert you to along the way, things that I think we need to think about that don't necessarily yet have a strong presence in the standards, and they may never, but they are considerations that you'll need to think about as you're teaching them. So my goal is just to offer you background on students' causal reasoning in the science classroom and how it may interact with the cause and effect cross-cutting concepts. So I noticed when you were giving information before to Bryn as she was polling you that a number of you had attended the recent webinar that Kristen Gunkel presented on the cross-cutting concept of patterns. And, when you start to talk about, when you move from a description of pattern to an explanation, at this point you're in the territory of causality. Instead of description, you're giving an accounting of why something happened. And there are many places in the standards integrated with science and engineering practices, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, constructing explanations, designing solutions. Where causality plays a key role, it's an underlying concept that is, as they say, cross-cutting. So what I'd like to do as we get started is have you think about what's in your mind now as you hear the words cause and effect in connection to science learning. What does it draw to mind for you? What kinds of concepts, what kinds of experiences perhaps with your classes, conversations, etc. So take a few moments and jot down 2 or 3 ideas.
Tina, do you want them to just write that down here, or do you want them to put it in the chat on a sheet of paper, or do you want them to put it in the chat?
I thought for each of them, but if a few of them want to write it down, they could. That would be lovely. I'm really a novice at this.
Either way
so
works fine. It's whether you wanted to see what they wrote or not. It's really all that matters.
Yeah. If it's easy to do it, let's do it. But if it's not, don't worry about it.
So Tina, it looks like we've got some interesting ideas coming into our chat window.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very nice. I'm watching some of the ideas coming in. As you heard me just say to Ted, I'm a bit of a novice at webinars, so you may hear them coaching me periodically.
You're doing great, Tina.
All right.
And,
so
yeah.
Okay, so some of the kinds of things that I'm hearing represent the language that's in the standards, and indeed some of the kind of language that we may often hear from our students as well, that things have, a beginning and ending. There's a before and after component. Some of these have to do with controlling and isolating variables, controlling for and isolating variables. So let me take a look right now with you at the way the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect is given in the standards. And let's look at how they shift and change over the different grade levels. This is the January 2013 draft, and what you see at the K-2 grade level is a focus on events. Okay, and they events have causes that generate observable patterns. This is an important idea because events are often attention-grabbing. They pull our attention towards something happening, and then we're compelled often to explain why it happened. There's some caveats about that, which I'll talk about later, but this idea, very appropriate for the youngest grades to be focusing on observable patterns and events that are attention-grabbing. There's also a little bit of a focus on simple kinds of tests that can be designed to gather evidence to support or refute ideas about causes, so early ideas about testing and fair testing that builds as you get to grades 3 and 5. So by grades 3 and 5, here is where in the scientific and engineering practices we start to see a focus on controlling for variables and fair tests as part of it, planning and carrying out investigations. But here we're focused on being able to identify and test cause and effect relationships, and also starting to consider the idea, which we'll see it developing in the later grades, that events can regularly occur together, but that doesn't mean that it's a cause and effect relationship necessarily. So this can be, an aspect of correlation. So at the next level, we see that we're expecting students to be able to classify relationships as correlational or causal, and at that point, we also want them to have that explicit ability to reflect on the idea that correlation may not imply causation. So this invites them to realize that if you see a pattern between two things, it may be that they have that there's a third variable involved. It could be a spurious relationship. Something else could be going on. And that fits very much with the next set of ideas that phenomena may have more than one cause. So this is the concept of multiple sufficient cause, that you can have more than one cause for an effect. The other idea that is big and actually is very much developed at grades 9 to 12 is the concept of probabilistic causation. And here is where we're starting to think about evidence as statistical, whereas you still think, so you may have you may be doing a test of a certain claim, but you're still able to use evidence that is statistically related to the outcome. So for example, if there's something that you suspect is a cause and it has a statistical relationship to cancer, for example, you would still consider it a carcinogen if that relationship was substantial enough, even though it doesn't have a one-to-one relationship. At the 9th through 12th grade level, you'll see that those abilities are elaborated, and students are expected to be able to make specific claims about causes and effects, and to be able to use empirical evidence to differentiate between causation and correlation when it's just a pattern of two things that work together versus a causal relationship between them. So I'm going to move forward here and ask you, given that, what seems hardest to you about teaching cause and effect? And if neither A, B, C, or D fits for you, then why don't you type some things in the window for us and tell us what some of the other things are.
Okay, everybody, your poll buttons are now active and open. So if you look right under your own name at the top of the participants window, you can find that button. It has an A on it, and if you mouse over, you'll be able to pick A through E to let us know which best fits for you. And as Tina said, if you do end up selecting E, you can give us some more details there in the chat window. Yes, and I'm seeing Sue typed in all of the above as a challenge, and Michelle is agreeing. This is great. If you haven't yet voted, go ahead and take a moment to do that now. We'll be locking the poll here in another moment just so we can get a look at the aggregate responses. We'll see what everyone has given us so far. If you've typed in the chat, remember to pick at least one answer there from the poll button so we'll be able to get you counted. And I'll go ahead and lock the poll now and put up a graph of our responses like we did in our intro. Pull this down here a little bit and turn it back to Tina to discuss our results.
Okay. So I'm seeing that knowing how to teach cause and effect to different grades and ages is fairly significant, as is making sense of the causal concepts in the next generation science standards. Fewer of you are concerned about how to talk about it or figuring out how it fits into the curriculum, which I guess kind of makes sense because in a sense that the standards map some of that. Although I think there's plenty to be discovered as we sort of move forward in actually implementing the standards. But so let me talk a little bit about the concepts that are in the standards and how they fit with reasoning about both pattern and mechanism, because this connects very much to teaching it at different grades and ages. So let's start there. There are three really big ideas in here. The idea that causes generate observable patterns, the distinctions between correlation and causation, and probabilistic causation. And these introduce different issues at different ages. So let's look at each one. But we're going to look at it through two big ideas in causal learning. And that is that when we talk about causal reasoning, we're talking about both how students reason about causal patterns and causal mechanisms. So when I say pattern here, I mean something a little bit different than what Kristen may have shared with the group last time when she talked about descriptive patterns. Here we're talking about patterns of impact. So let me give you some examples. So causal patterns refer to how the impacts unfold. And one of the things that we find in the research is that often kids come to us with fairly simple ideas about causal patterns. They may have very simple linear notions, but yet the phenomenon that they're trying to explain may have an extended linear pattern. It might be more domino-like. Perhaps it's a mutual causation. We often see these in biology in instances of symbiosis and parasitism, commensalism. It may be a cyclic kind of pattern, and by that I don't mean simply a cycle. I don't mean something like the seasons, but I mean a cyclic pattern where one thing causes another thing, and they continue in a repeating cycle of causality. Similarly, spiraling might be another example where you actually have an escalation of impact, but it's also a form of cyclic causality. Another that's quite common, and I'll show you some examples of it as well a little later, is a relational causality where you actually have two variables and the relationship between those two variables leads to an outcome. Now, there may well be others. These are ones that we've researched and worked with students around for a number of years and investigated how they impact their science understanding. But often, we encourage sort of a simple, not we, but in the world, students walk away with a simple linear notion of causality. And earlier I said something about the way that cause and effect is framed in the standards. I think that one of my concerns about framing it as cause and effect is that it reinforces that simple linear notion that they have a temporal relationship. One happens before the other, and then you're done. So one of the things in talking about causality is that we need to be a little careful not to reduce causal patterns to this simple linear notion. The other part that researchers talk about is about the words causal mechanism. And so I'm going to invite you to stop and think about what that means. This session talks about causal mechanism and explanation. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it fits with pattern in a few moments. But I want to give you a chance to just stop and think, what do those words mean to you, particularly in terms of your classroom? All right, so if causal pattern is how impacts unfold, when we're talking about causal mechanism, here we're talking about what makes the processes or events happen. And I've chosen on this slide to use the words processes or events. A concern I mentioned earlier for the K-2 performance expectation is that it focuses very much on events. The reason that feels like a concern is because events are attention-grabbing. They tend to get us to notice them. In the sciences, that can be a little bit of a problem because often processes are the background sort of status quo. They're things that are going on much of the time. And one of the things we want to avoid is encouraging students to think about cause and effect, as only being event-like. We ultimately want them to attend to processes and events as they think about steady states, processes, and changes over time, which are other concepts in the standards. The choice to say events, I don't know that I totally, I think there's reasons to do that. I think it's simplifying for the grade level, but at the same time, there are many places in the standards where what the kids are actually doing focuses on a process. So I don't think it's absent from the standards. I think it's just a choice in terms of language. But let's look at mechanism for a few moments. So mechanism is what's making the process or the event happen. And it can be described at different levels. So if you think about the current in a simple circuit and what makes it flow, flipping a switch can. It could be that it's opening a circuit and allowing current to flow. You might explain the mechanism in terms of voltage creating a push from the battery, and that pushes electrons along a circuit. Another mechanism that you might use to explain it at a different level might be the differential between electrons and protons at the poles of the battery repelling and attracting electrons so that they move. So the mechanism has different, it really can be described at different levels, and one of the implications of that is that as you start to describe mechanism at different levels, often what you talk about in terms of cause and effect changes. What's actually considered the cause. Let me ask you to stop and think. I'm going to elaborate that statement in just a moment, but let me ask you to stop and take a moment to think about a mechanism in a topic that you teach and what a few different levels are that it can be talked about at. So I've given an example just now. See if you can come up with one from what you are teaching. And Bryn, is this a good place to have people type in the comment box?
Yeah, Tina, this is a great opportunity to have them do that.
Okay. So if anyone's feeling brave about that, it would be great.
These are some great responses coming into the chat. Tina, what do you think about some of these responses from the teachers?
I think they're really interesting, and I think, one of the things that I would ask people to think about is how, as you describe each of these, how does the actual mechanism that you have in mind as an educator interact with what the kids might have in mind? So depending upon the age group. So, talking about density and pressure, for example. So maybe kids are thinking about crowdedness. Maybe they're thinking about the relationship between, atomic mass and bonding, et cetera. So at what level are you asking them to think about mechanism? And this is something that, you'll be grappling with as you teach these different topics. It also interacts with how kids understand the science and how deeply. And what I'd like to show you is an example of how pattern and mechanism interact, and you'll see how understanding, I think, how seeing mechanism at different levels interacts with how deeply they understand the concept. So let me show you a slide and just think for a moment. You don't need to list these. You can just think about what your students would say. So this picks up on the density idea. But think about what your students might say what is going on when an object sinks or floats. So I'm going to keep moving here just to show it as an example. So here's an example where pattern and mechanism clearly interact. So if a student thinks here that weight is the thing making it sink, as this student does, and they're reasoning about the weight, they often come away with a simple linear model of cause and effect. I drop the object in, the weight makes it sink. And so the mechanism and the pattern fit together here. Yet, if you're studying density, likely you want students to have a relational causality here. So you want them to realize that when you drop something into a liquid, it's the relationship between the density of the object, if it's an object, might be a liquid, might be two liquids, but it's the density of the object and the density of the liquid and the relationship between the two that causes the outcome. So again, if you're reasoning from a density-related mechanism, you're going to come up with a different pattern, a different causal pattern, than if you're reasoning from a weight-based notion of a mechanism. And one of the implications that this has for instruction is that often we interact around patterns in ways that reinforce simple notions of mechanism. So it's very common in the early grades to see people talking about sinkers and floaters and attaching to the object the idea of mechanism, that the weight makes it sink and that it's about the object, instead of being about the relationship between the two things, either the two liquids or the liquid and the object. And we often also see curriculum that's, professional curriculum sometimes that reinforces this kind of idea. So the idea here is that as we think about mechanism, we also have to think about pattern, and we need to think about the different levels at which we're describing mechanism to students or having students engage with mechanism and how they're connecting that to the patterns. So one other thing about mechanism is that often for scientifically accepted models, you can have more than one mechanism that's accepted, so a buoyancy explanation or a density explanation in this case. I'm going to show you one other example of how pattern and mechanism interact, and this comes from work that we're doing with students on circuit electricity. So in the first model, it's a simple linear model, but there kids have a consumer source model of what's going on. They think about the mechanism as being energy moving down the wire to the bulb and making the bulb light. I have a lot of electrical cords that have been cut down the middle and then taped back together because we pull them apart to show the kids that it's a big circle. In the second example, where it's a double linear model, here these are students who've often learned about static electricity. And so they have protons going up one side and electrons going up the other side, and they imagine that they clash in the bulb. So the mechanism here is an attraction between protons and electrons. And that's a very clever idea. It's not the scientifically accepted model, but it's very clever, and it goes along with this double linear idea. The third model, the cyclic sequential model, is one we see often in elementary school. Here the students think of the circuit as being empty until electrons fill it, and then they come around and keep going to light the bulb, and then if it's a series circuit with other bulbs along the way, those bulbs will light up, they think, later, or maybe they won't be as bright, etc. And then there's two other models here, a cyclic simultaneous one where there's electrons all along the circuit and they actually start to flow and move when the battery is hooked up. And the last one, which is a differential model. But you can see in the student models above that how they think about pattern and the cause, for the causal force involved, are very much connected. So I'm going to stop there for questions. And I think that, Bryn, either you or Ted are going to help me.
We're set to do this.
Great.
I'm going to start off with, just as an opening piece, I'm reminded of when I was a high school physics teacher, and I had a student who was taking chemistry and came in to ask me for help one day and asked me to help explain density, and I went into this whole thing as a physics teacher about net force and the force on the top of the object and the force a little, and all her teacher had really wanted at that point was denser or less dense, and so I had her totally confused in class the next day when she did that. So your idea of different models really rings with some of my experiences of thinking about what models that we're working with at any point in time. But start off here with a question from Rachel. She says, in literacy I find most cause and effect uses is simple linear. Students bring this knowledge into the science classroom and try to get everything to fit the simple linear. Have you ever tried using the 6 patterns in literacy? I wonder if it could be a powerful link that cuts across disciplines. I mean, I think the basic idea is, are you aware of any times where the patterns you described there are used in non-science classes?
We have seen them used in non-science classes because we introduce them to teachers in workshops on causality and cause and effect. And so we've seen them in math class often, thinking about relationships, sort of algebraic concepts, you know, that it's the relationship between two things that causes an outcome. It causes in a descriptive sense in math, or in a definitive sense, I should say. We've also seen all of those patterns in the social sciences. So often kids will talk about, I'm just trying to think of a good example. Spiraling causality, often in issues of conflict. Kids often think of escalation as the issue, but they also know that sometimes their teacher speaks more and more and more quietly to get their attention and to get them to attend. Some of our 5th graders were learning about escalating causality in science, and they came running in to get their teacher one day. Miss Ryan, we have escalating causality on the playground. And she had gone out, and 2 kids were having quite a disagreement. And, you know, so the idea was they needed a cool down, and they knew it. And so we do see these in other areas. And some of the teachers we work with work very hard to transfer those between the sciences and other topics, but also from social instances where kids tend to have a lot of knowledge.
Great, thanks. Kathy asked, and I just scrolled it. She was curious about in what ways would you change the sinkers and floaters and still be appropriate for young children? I'm going to show you a little bit in a few minutes, but let me say a little bit about it. When I was running a play and learning group, I have twins, they're now 12, but when they were 3 and 4, I ran a play and learning group for them and a number of their friends. And in the context of that group, we set up, we took the water table and we set it up with rice in it.
We actually attached a pulley to the top of the ceiling. We put a pulley at the bottom of the water table. We took 2 bottles and attached them to the ropes on either side. And what the kids started, and we cut the bottoms off so kids could fill them, and then they could take the tops off and dump them back out again. And the kids very quickly learned that they could not manipulate one without manipulating the other. We also talked a lot about what happens when they were on a seesaw. What happens when you're, does it matter who's on the other side? And they started to realize, well, there's another instance where you can't manipulate one without impacting the other. So there were concrete things that we did, but we also had them play with salt water. We have an experiment I'm going to show you in a few minutes having to do with alcohol and water. So there are things that we did to what we call recast or reveal the causal structure in the concept a little bit differently for the kids.
Great. I'm going to throw one more question here from Jim McDonald. If I go down here, that he was curious about, when do you introduce mechanism? When is it appropriate for a grade or an age?
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, mechanism is a concept that's available to kids from a pretty early age. I would say you see preschoolers already thinking about it. So some of you may have seen in the previous Super Bowl the commercial where the little boy has the clicker, the remote control, and I know the dad has the remote control. The little boy is out there trying to make everything work with magic, and the dad uses the remote control on the car, and the child jumps back. Well, if you think about it, very early on, children start to accept the idea that causes and effects can behave in interesting ways through the control of certain kinds of mechanisms. They learn that a remote control can work something at a distance, which overrides other ideas they have about causes and effects having to touch each other, which is what they typically think for physical causality. You start to see them developing ideas about social mechanisms and how they're different. So here's what I would say. I would say that you can introduce mechanism fairly early on when it grows out of the student's experiences. But as soon as the mechanism starts to become something abstract or inferred, then you need to start thinking about how you're going to scaffold that understanding. I think it's fine to focus on non-obvious mechanisms by, if they're really tiny. We've done this in the 1st and 2nd grade, helping kids see the microorganisms in water, pond water, for example. So it has to build from their experience, and they have plenty of experience of mechanisms. It's sort of building the understanding in a way that, once you're getting to something that's inferred and they can't see it and they can't hold it, helping them grasp that it's there.
So I'm understanding you right, because that connects to some of the conversation I think that's going on in the chat here. The aspect is you can have a whole bunch of links. I think that was maybe the domino effect that you described in the piece. And early on, young children are only really going to be able to handle sort of one link in that chain. For example, that they may only be able to deal with the idea, using something I put in the chat, that it's warm in the summer and cold in the winter. And that's their sense of causality at that point, which is just an observation. And you're going to have to work a whole bunch of ways down the line to wait till they're older before you can start getting into the tilt of the Earth relative to the sun and its motions around the sun has something to do with when it's warm and when it's cold. Am I getting
right,
the line here, or have I
missed a beat? Well, that has a lot of cognitive load to holding that in your head. Let me give an example that's maybe a little more straightforward. So
yep.
The younger grades, if we talk to them about an effect that is caused from far away, so think about climate change, for instance. We are having an effect by our actions here on organisms very, very far from us. But we cannot easily trace that path. We can't see carbon in the atmosphere. We can't see the mechanisms that create that. The amount of cognitive load to understand that is very hard, and that's not for the youngest grades. However, one way to start to talk about causes and effects that are very far apart in space and time is to focus on mechanisms that they do understand. So for example, we've been working with some of the younger grades on the concept of how big is a watershed. Because water they can trace. They can see that water flows from this tributary and that tributary, and it all comes together to this place. And so they can trace, the mechanism is traceable for them. It's obvious, it's less abstract. So they know how to think about it. And then once you've built those understandings, you can start to talk about non-obvious ones in the later grades that involve more cognitive load. I hope that helps. I don't think there's a simple answer to the question, but it's a little bit of what you would do.
Nope, I think that's very helpful in sort of getting some ideas here. Why don't we go along here and we'll do some more questions a little bit.
Yep. Okay, so the next concept I want to talk about a little bit is correlation versus causation. This is a huge idea and really important in the standards. So listen to the two following statements. There's a pattern between higher rates of ice cream consumption and obesity. There's a different statement. There's a pattern between ice cream consumption and drownings. So for most people, the first one makes sense. And they kind of go, oh yes, I can see where ice cream consumption could be a mechanism for obesity. The second one sends them on a search for a mechanism. And in that case, it may be that they're just correlations, and the second one involves realizing that there may be a third variable called hot weather involved. So there's a third causal link there. So it's the first two are just correlational. So the standards are asking you to think about evidence that something is causal. So this means focusing on mechanism. And the kind of evidence that you're going to use at different points depends upon the discipline. So in the discipline, in physics often, we might use intervention or experimentation. I'm going to show an example of this from the kindergarten performance expectations in just a moment. But yet, in natural contexts, in the biosciences, we typically would look for opportunity or natural experiments because we're not necessarily going to intervene to create a test, to search for mechanism, to move from correlation to causation. So here are some of the kindergarten performance expectations. In the first one, we're asking that students construct an explanation for plants and animals, for how plants and animals, including humans, can change their environment while meeting their basic needs. And their clarification statement was an example of a squirrel that digs / burrows in the ground to hide its food. So there, you're not going to be creating an experiment. You're going to need to observe, and it is going to have that before and after. It wasn't there, it is there now, or this is what the animal's done. But that's the biological sciences, very different than what you might do for the second example, where they're asking that kids are able to design and conduct investigations to test the idea that some materials can be solid or liquid depending upon temperature. So there, you might talk about what you can put in the freezer and what happens, in manipulating temperature. So you're actually intervening as opposed to observing. And I think for causality, it's really important that we not focus just on the idea that you have to always be testing something, because often it is this very careful observation and opportunistic focus that lets you construct the explanations that are needed for the first one. So what I want to do is also look next at 3 examples, and these are all from the Interdependent Relationships and Ecosystems, and the first one is the one that I just mentioned. The second one is from middle school, using a model to support explanations of the effect of resource availability on organisms and populations of organisms in an ecosystem. And the last one is high school. Evaluate evidence for its merits in supporting the role of group behavior on individual and species chances to survive and reproduce. So let's look at how these 3 might play out a little bit differently. So here's the kindergarten example. And here, you're focusing on constructing this explanation, on gathering evidence for the notion that animals can be designers. They can change their environment while meeting their basic needs. So, the focus here would be more on gathering information. These are things you can see. If you think about the cognitive load in this problem space, it's not, students don't have to imagine non-obvious causes. They can imagine the behavior of the animal. Fits very much for kindergarten. Fits from what they know from their experience about how they behave. So very much a appropriate kindergarten example for how you would get to an explanation. But notice you're not, intervening. I don't think we should go play with the beavers here. It's dangerous. So, the idea here is that you're looking for evidence that supports your explanation. As we go to the middle school example, here the focus is on using a model to support an explanation. And this one specifically focuses on resource availability. The graph that I'm showing you is from a multi-user virtual environment called EcoMove that my colleague Chris Beatty and Sherry Metcalf, Amy Kim Rainen, and Shane Tutwiler and I have created. And this is an environment that students go into, and it looks very much like a real pond, sounds like a real pond. It doesn't smell like a real pond, and it doesn't squish below your feet like a real pond. But they spend time moving around in this environment, and in that context, they start collecting data because they discover that something's happened. There's sort of a problem to be explained. And in order to explain it and to support their explanation well, they need to think about these different resources and how they're available. So the EcoMove provides different graphing capacities. So this would be an example of the kind of thing you would be doing in middle school, where you're supporting the explanation, looking at how these resources have certain kinds of limits and how the limits and the ways that these resources change impact populations of organisms. So you can see that the lines correspond, so the black one is the largemouth bass population. So what might it look like in high school? So high school, here you're introducing the idea of modeling by varying the inputs, but you also have this concept of probabilistic outcomes. So it's not that there's a cause and an effect with a deterministic relationship. This makes that happen. Instead, behavior, in this instance group behavior, impacts individuals and it impacts species, but we're looking at both in terms of the outcome, and at the species level we can say that something is causal even if it didn't impact every fish. So what do I mean by that? So this is a picture of fish schooling, and it comes from the MIT Teacher Education program, this program to the side here called Big Fish, Little Fish. In Big Fish, Little Fish, the students all get a handheld device, and it's a participatory simulation. So in that, the device has information programmed into it, and they are given a role. They're either a big fish or a little fish. And then they can engage in different behaviors to see how their behavior impacts their population data. So the population data would be projected on the board, and everybody would have their handheld device, and some of the students would be little fish and some would be big fish. And the little fish, they could school, they could hide, they could try to swim really fast to get away from the students who are big fish. So, and they can experiment with what happens as they shift and change those behaviors. They also have the option in this program to change the assumptions within the model. So the model might assume that if they don't eat after a certain amount of time, they will die and they won't go on to reproduce. But they can change some of those assumptions, and they can change the period, for which they can survive, etc. So here, this is an example of being able to collect evidence and reason about the input and the output in terms of individual and species chances of survival. And it's the statistical probabilistic outcome that matters. So that's an example of how it might look quite different as you go from a kindergarten example where you're really looking at concrete evidence, concrete outcomes, and then moving up to high school where you're actually reasoning probabilistically, not deterministically, not the beaver built the house, but this fish is behaving in this way, and sometimes that will cause him to be eaten, and sometimes it might not because it's sort of summing across instead. So those are some examples. I'm going to put this slide up only briefly because people were less concerned about this. One of the things that we focus on quite a lot in the classrooms that we work in is creating a language of causality. It's not there. We don't have a rich language of causality in our culture. And the language that we have in the classrooms we've worked in have really come from the students. They have introduced ideas, and they were responsible for the term domino causality. Some of the students modified escalating causality to be spiraling causality to acknowledge the idea that things can spiral up or spiral down. So for all of these, developing an explicit language and a way to discuss the causality is an important part of the task. And I think I was going to ask this question, but Bryn, I'm going to guess that we don't need to ask this question because so few people seemed interested in it.
That's fine, Tina,
fair?
if you want to keep going.
Okay, all right. So a few caveats. So what I tried to do is capture the concepts that are in the next generation science standards pertaining to causality. However, there's some that are in there that have the potential to be confusing, depending upon how they play out. And there's some things that may come up that I think you'll want to be aware of that fit with some of the comments actually that you've been making as well about things that students say. So the first one is the one that I mentioned earlier, this distinction between cause and effect and a rich notion of causality, which really leaves behind this idea that it's, a cause and effect in space and time, and that they have a clear temporal relationship to each other. Once you focus on cause and then effect, you're often talking about simple linear causality. And we've said that there are richer ways to conceive causality, and that those different forms of causality are inherent in different science concepts at different levels, particularly as you're explaining different mechanisms. The other big term or concept to be careful with, the notion of event versus events and processes. So we've done a lot of work recently with ecosystem scientists, and what they have said to us is, we do reason about events, we do reason about processes, we talk about disturbances, but we put all of that in a broader context of change over time. So even though events draw our attention just the way they draw students' attention, we then ask not what just happened, but what's been going on? What's the broader landscape of what's happening here? So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We see this in social studies and in politics. Often politicians talk about focusing events. So, 9/11 was a focusing event, and we focused a lot of resources on combating terrorism. And so, that may be something that we would have decided anyway had we had a national conversation on how to expend resources, focused on things that are of concern. So, maybe we would have focused on climate change, maybe we would have focused on terrorism, but a focusing event grabs our attention and it often galvanizes us to do something. It works the same way in science. So for that reason, it's really important to also focus on processes and change over time. And the last one has to do with, as you get up into the middle school and high school grades, and you're reasoning about probabilistic causality and this statistical summing across patterns, this can create confusion for students about the role of reliability. We spent a year looking at how students thought about probabilistic causation in kindergarten, second grade, fourth grade, and sixth grade. And what we saw between the 4th and the 6th grade was that often students who reasoned appropriately, probabilistically in the 4th grade found it harder by the 6th grade because they were pulled by this idea that if their experiment didn't work the way they expected, that they didn't have reliability. That if the outcome was the outcome, it should be the outcome each time. So these concepts need a place to have conversation about them and talk about them. One other thing I'm going to present is a list that I won't describe all of. This is really sort of the key aspect of the research that we've been doing. We've been looking at how assumptions about patterns and features of causality can pull kids away from understanding science concepts deeply. And, you know, a lot of the assumptions that we have are assumptions that serve us very well in our everyday causal reasoning. We often narrow our vision instead of broaden it. We're focused on being efficient and getting something done at the time. We can't take in all the stimulation coming to us, so we have to narrow our focus. It also comes from a very powerful place. As little tiny babies, as we learned that we could do things and make things happen, that we had agency, we often learned that we could hit something and make a noise. We could call out and someone would come. So those are simple linear relationships connected to our own personal agency that are very powerful. However, lots of the forms of causality that we ask kids to learn in science don't involve agency. They're non-agentive in many ways. And they also sort of fall towards the right side of this slide. They might be nonlinear or indirect. They may have spatially distant causes, things we can't see in our own domain. So these are very well explained elsewhere, so I'm not going to spend more time with them now because I want to have time for people to ask questions. But let me just, well, I'll put this is a slide with some of the examples of where we've seen some of these things across different topics, and some of these I've already shown you. But these have to do with what I talked about earlier when I talked about a recast activity. So in our own work, when we see students making these simplifying ideas about causality, we have introduced activities to help push their thinking to a different level. So this is the one I mentioned earlier. And here we have 2 beakers, and we have 2 pieces of candle, a small piece and a large piece. And we show the 2 pieces of the candle to the kids, and we ask them what will happen when we drop them into the beakers. And this is what they say. They say the small one will float and the big one will sink. And so we drop them in, and indeed that's what happens. And then we swap them. And here, they first say, well, you tricked us. And we say, well, how does that change your thinking? And they say, well, it seems like you must have done something to the liquid. So then they start to realize that it's that relational causality that I talked about earlier, that it's the relationship between the 2 that's making it sink or float, not this simple linear, I drop it in and it's about the object. And then of course they mess with both of them, and they put them both in one, they put them both in the other, they start mixing the liquids, they do 2 different things. But one of those is isopropyl rubbing alcohol, and the other is water. So that's an example of a recast activity. We have a lot of them. We have a website, actually. It's presently at this sort of long address up at the top, and it's moving shortly. But this has our curriculum focused on different kinds of causal patterns. One of these has been taken up by the Massachusetts Department of Education. They've taken our density unit, and they're actually reworking it so that it will have more connections to the current version of the standards, because this is slightly older work. It's from 4 or 5 years ago, and they're reworking it so that teachers can use it in service of the standards as a model curriculum. But there's some other things there too. So it's just one way to talk about causality and to think about causality. So given that, I'm going to stop and see what kinds of questions people have. I feel like this is a lot. I feel like I don't think that cause and effect is an easy topic. I think that it's something we think about in every aspect of our lives, and it can be taught well at all different grade levels, but I don't think it's necessarily easy to do or apparent, how to approach it. So one of the things I look forward to as the standards become finalized is working with educators to develop curriculum to help you find ways to really teach what's in the standards around cause and effect or causality in service of the performance expectations, looking across the science and engineering practices and the disciplinary core ideas along with the cross-cutting concepts. So,
great. No, thank
I'm
you.
Stop there.
I'm reminded of the line Tom Hanks uses in A League of Their Own when it's the hard that makes it worth doing. And I think that's probably true with causal patterns as well that we go through. So just glancing over here, Vanashri, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, asks the following. Do you suggest talking about cause and effects explicitly similar to different aspects of the nature of science in order to develop a better understanding of these concepts with students?
I do. I think that students need to realize that not only is cause and effect and different types of cause and effect important in science, but that we have tendencies in the way that we reason that make it hard to see certain kinds of patterns in science. So in a sense, I'm suggesting that teachers talk to them about the causal patterns in the science at different levels and talk to them about their tendencies to reason in certain ways about causality. That we tend to make things simpler than they are because in the moment that often works well. I'm not sure if I've answered the question
I think you've
fully,
hit on some pieces here. A lot of comments here referencing language, and I think some of your slides point this out. Assuming one of the tricky pieces here, as it is the case in a lot of aspects of science, is that the difference between everyday language and what we are sort of our scientific definitions of language, and then talk about cause and effect, that comes up and can complicate things. Is that your experience?
I think that's right, and I think that when I looked at the drafts of the standards, one of the puzzles that came out is that we don't have a very sophisticated language of causality, and because we don't, I think it was hard for them to, the developers, to really talk about how causality interacted in different places. Because if you really think it's cause and then effect, and it's event-based, then that really limits how it interacts with the science itself.
And that makes sense. So folks, if you've got some other questions, please feel free to post them up there. I'm going to dig back a little bit, see, I think we had one or two that we didn't answer from the first piece here. Let's see. So Alan Gilmore asked earlier, it's interesting to know the differentiation of mechanisms into subtypes, my tongue is tied, hierarchical and otherwise. Need we become adept at the formal labeling of the type of mechanism? And I guess I would extend on that, do our students need to become adept at that?
Here's the puzzle. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer the question because I don't know if I have advice about it. But here's the thing. So Mitch Resnick and Uri Walensky did some work looking at reasoning across different levels in science problems. And one of the things that you see is that the components, what you construct the understanding out of, and the causal relationships between them depends upon the level. And therefore, it becomes really important that teachers have a sense in their own understanding goals for a lesson what level they're asking kids to understand the concept at. Whether you need to describe mechanisms at different levels, I'm not sure about that. But I do know that it's important to think deeply about when you're teaching a set of concepts, what are your understanding goals? At what level are you expecting kids to understand the mechanism? And in that, given that, what are the causal relationships? So, I showed a slide earlier, and it contrasted what we called cyclic simultaneous causality in the simple circuit, and that's the one where it's all filled up with electrons and they all move at once, and that makes the bulb light. And I compared that to the idea that kids often learn in high school, that there's a differential involved, and that the differential is what causes the flow, in a sense. So either of those models will give you correct answers to certain kinds of questions. You could use either one to push your attention from the individual particles to the system thinking to be able to correctly predict what will happen due to Ohm's law, to predict what will happen due to series and parallel circuits, things like that. You would get correct answers with either one, but yet they are different, and one of them is going to help, the second one will help you move on more. But the first one, the cyclic simultaneous model, probably works just fine in the 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, as kids are building their understanding of a circuit as a system, and they're not yet reasoning about electrical potential and differential. So that's just an example from our previous work, and eventually we'll have examples like that for what's in the current standards as well, as these get adopted and put into use.
That makes sense. Do you have any suggestions about how to assess students' understanding of cause and effect? And have you come across some common misconceptions students might have about this relationship, other than it's a linear relationship?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do when we're assessing the relationship of how students are reasoning about causality to the science concept is we break down what the likely models are going to be. So you saw it in that electrical circuits example, but in reasoning about sinking and floating, we knew that many of the kids, just looking at their explanations, came in with this simple linear notion, weight makes it sink. And then we went from there to when do they start to realize that there's a non-obvious variable, because the fluid is sort of, they think of it as standard and the backdrop. So they're sort of starting at the level of not paying attention to it at all, to starting to realize it's part of the equation, to starting to realize that it's a relationship and that it's part of the equation in a very specific way. So we actually developed rubrics that scored where kids were in terms of the causal concepts, the underlying causal concepts, and then use that to assess whether they were really understanding in a deep way the idea of relative density. So that's an important, relative density is important if you're going to understand, why we have layers of the atmosphere and, how a plane takes off. There's all sorts of places where relative density is important. So we actually developed rubrics. Those are on that website that I mentioned. There's a number of sample rubrics there. Other misconceptions. So, well, I think, we see it with the cyclic causality, where students reduce the idea of a cyclic arrangement to a simple linear one. But we also see it when there's instances of mutual causation where you need to have two things, but one of them seems more causally powerful because it's a more active player in a sense. So think about gravity. Kids often talk about gravity as a simple linear concept, not an attraction, a mutual causation. And, if all you want to think about is the Earth's gravity and how it impacts us here on Earth, maybe that will get you fairly far. But as soon as you start to reason about the tides and what's going on Earth, the influence of other heavenly bodies on our planet, then you really need a mutual concept of causality for gravitational attraction.
Now that's
another example.
Great. I mean, I always think one of the the most difficult things for us to deal with in science education is that an expert in any discipline often pulls a lot of different models of how a particular that can be used to explain a phenomena or make predictions about a phenomena, and they choose a model, and it's various how complex or how simple it is, and don't give a lot of conscious thought about that they've done that, even though there's a lot of intentionality there in terms of what they're doing, and getting students to be able to know and eventually learn what model to use under what conditions is a real challenge, I think, in helping students learn about any particular physical phenomena. So one of the pieces here, how important, I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, about the terminology, and that there wasn't really a direct answer to, correct me if I'm wrong, about having them, there isn't any strong advice you have in terms of using particular language to describe the relationships they see, whether it's a linear one or a cyclic. Did I recall your answer correctly there?
Well, I think it's helpful there to have a language and have a language of, to differentiate those kinds of patterns. The question I was less sure about was the labeling of different mechanisms. I think, if you think that getting to an understanding involves conceptual change through a set of models, then it might be really instructive to describe those models and have a language that goes with them. But I don't think that's a foregone conclusion. I think it depends if your students are progressing through them to get to a more complex understanding. So, for example, in the electrical circuits example that I showed, some kids never use that double linear model. They haven't studied static electricity to any great depth, and they don't talk about that model, which could be, as much as I think they should understand static electricity, it could be good because it's a model that's very compelling and it's so strong that a lot of times kids get pretty stuck there if nobody helps them to see where it falls down. So it may be that kids go from a linear model to a cyclic kind of sequential model. I don't know that, those are the words you would use. It depends what age group. Our fourth graders talked about causes and effects all at once when they talked about simultaneous causality, and causes and effects in a line, when they talked about cyclic, sequential. But I don't, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it has to serve the end goal and the understanding that you're trying to get at for the students. Otherwise, I don't know that there's a value to it, but I do think it's helpful in differentiating ideas that they have to actually come up with a terminology and help them see, particularly when it's a prevalent model.
That's great. So we're going to close up now. I'm going to shift and give you some examples of other resources, and get back, Tina, after that for a few last-minute questions after people have filled out their surveys and things. And one of the things I heard earlier that I think I'd sort of give you set up to be thinking about is you had this earlier slide about how the impacts unfold. Someone had asked for maybe some examples of the different types here, and if you may be able to ready to provide some examples of that in a little while, I think that would be appreciated by a lot of folks here. All right.
Sure.
And so let me just jump you back to my slide. Here we go. And so, obviously, Tina obviously wants to thank do you want to say anything about your funding here, Tina?
No, I think it kind of speaks for itself. That's just the NSF and the IES have been very generous to us to do this work for a number of years. So that's just our acknowledgement.
Great, thank you. I want to point out for everybody here the NSTA website, nsta.org, and on that page you can find a link to our standards page, or you can go directly to it with nsta.org/NGSS, and you'll find lots of different information and resources there to work with. I also want to point out, it's been mentioned a couple different times here, we've had a great conversation in the chat tonight. We've got our discussion forum, our community forum, specifically around the next generation science standards. It'll be a great place for folks to continue that conversation as they go along. We've talked about the framework, which you can get from the NSTA bookstore, and also you can get you can look at the NSTA Reader's Guide to the framework as a helpful tag along there to help you interpret and understand the framework. We also have a number of articles about the standards, the framework, practices, cross-cutting concepts in our journals that I would recommend to you. I'm really hoping that a lot of folks here will be able to be in San Antonio. The standards, as I said, will be coming out very end of March, beginning of April, so that makes, as I like to say, San Antonio the place to be to learn about NGSS. You can pretty much go wall to wall just in sessions about NGSS if you want. A lot of the writers will be in attendance and you can ask some questions, and so hope to see you there. We'll be continuing our session in 2 weeks, March 19th. To talk about scale, proportion, and quantity. And so all these sessions, same bat time, same bat station on Tuesdays at 6:30 Eastern Time. Also point out, if you are interested, some of you have seen them, some of you haven't, archives of all our earlier web seminars are available in the Learning Center, and recommend those to you if you want to learn more. And our short courses starting up in April after the release of standards. 2 big topics that seem to be on everybody's mind: how to deal with assessments in the realm of NGSS, and so we'll have Paige Keeley talking about formative assessment, and then thinking about engineering, Christine Cunningham and Martha Davis from the Museum of Science in Boston did a lot of great work on engineering. And with that, I thank Tina very much for being here tonight, and turn things over to Bryn.
Thank you so much, Ted, and I would like to echo your appreciation to Tina. It was a very engaging presentation tonight, and we feel very lucky to have your expertise shared with us. Everyone, let's use our emoticon button. That's the one with the face on it, and you can select the applauding hands to give Tina and Ted a round of applause for tonight. We would like to thank the sponsor of today's web seminar, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And a thank you to the administration of NSTA for their support for web seminars. Here's a look at our upcoming web seminar calendar. On March 7th, you can join us for Engineering Design, Forces in Motion, the Great Boomerang Challenge. And then next week, you can learn how to make collections there in the NSTA Learning Center. And also later that evening, if you're looking for a later program, Chemistry of Water, Mars Exploration, Is There Water on Mars, will begin at 7:30 Eastern Time for you West Coasters. You can register for these programs and more by going to learningcenter.nsta.org/webseminars. We look forward to seeing you again on another web seminar, and thank you for your participation today.